In this lesson, we are going to talk about the aspects of our body systems that actually control our breathing. So there's two main things that help control breathing. One is nervous control, and that involves breathing centers in the brainstem that actually send nerve signals to our respiratory muscles. We also see chemical regulation. Now that's where our brain makes changes to our breathing, both our rate and the depth of our breathing, based on chemical concentrations in the blood. Now, we're going to talk about each of these two things separately and hopefully make them a little easier to understand for you. So first, let's look at the main breathing centers in the brain. Remember, these breathing centers are in the two parts of the brainstem called the medulla oblongata and the pons. In the medulla, we have the dorsal respiratory group, or DRG, and the ventral respiratory group, or VRG. In the pons, we have the pontine respiratory group, or PRG, as well as the anoustic center. Now, in this image, you'll see that the anoustic center sends signals to the DRG, which sends signals to the intercostal muscles, both the external intercostal muscles and the diaphragm. Now, if you remember from the breathing movements lesson, these two muscles, the external intercostals and the diaphragm, are the muscles involved in inhalation and normal at-rest exhalation. Now, the DRG also sends signals over to the VRG, if necessary, to control the accessory respiratory muscles like the abdominal muscles and the internal intercostals. This would be for rapid or forceful exhalation, like during exercise. So you'll also notice that the pontine respiratory group also sends inhibitory signals down to the DRG. And what happens is this becomes a little negative feedback loop to help us with our respiratory cycle. So let's look a little closer at how these different centers work together to help with breathing. Now, during normal quiet breathing, we don't really see that much happening. Basically, the DRG, or the dorsal respiratory group, is active for about 2 seconds, makes these respiratory muscles contract, allowing for inhalation, and then it's inactive for 3 seconds, allowing for those muscles to relax, which allows us to exhale, which again is kind of a passive process. We contract to inhale, simply relax to exhale. So all of this is controlled inside of the medulla by the DRG, or the dorsal respiratory group. But if we have to have more active, rapid, deep breathing, we've got to do things a little differently. So that's where the rest of these breathing centers come into play. In rapid, deep breathing, the anoustic center basically starts sending constant signals to the DRG. When the DRG gets stimulated, it sends signals to the respiratory muscles to inhale just like it did before. And it also sends signals to the PRG and the VRG. So let's look at what both of those centers do. The PRG is actually going to turn around and inhibit the anoustic center and the DRG. So basically, the anoustic center turned on the switch, which is the DRG, and the PRG turns right back around and turns them both off again. Now, in just a minute, I'm going to give you a little illustration that will make this make much more sense. But remember, the DRG also stimulated the VRG. So let's look at what happens there. So the VRG is going to stimulate these accessory respiratory muscles and the internal intercostals, and that's going to give us that forced exhalation. So we can go faster than we did before. And also, the VRG turns around and inhibits the dorsal respiratory group as well. So what the heck? The anoustic center turns on the DRG tells us to breathe, turns on the PRG and the VRG, which both turn around and turn the dang DRG off again. Well, again, this is our negative feedback loop, and that is what helps us to actually get this cycle in the respiratory system. So as soon as that DRG is off, these inhibitory signals will also stop, and so it allows us to turn the DRG back on again. It's a cycle. Let me give you an illustration that's really going to help this make sense. Now, some of you may have seen this before or something like it. The hand turns on the switch makes the box open, the arm comes out, turns off the switch, and the box closes again. So if you Google useless box or useless machine, you're going to find dozens of videos. Some of them are actually pretty funny. So how does this relate? Well, the anoustic center turns on the DRG and we inhale. That's the box opening. That turns on the PRG and VRG, that's our little arm here, which then turns the DRG back off again. The DRG is the switch, and it lets us exhale. That's the box closing. Then the anoustic center is now able to turn the DRG back on again. So let's look in more detail. So the hand here, that's the anoustic center. The switch itself is your DRG. The box opening is inhalation. The arm here is the PRG and the VRG. And then the box closing is exhalation. Okay, so anoustic center turns on the DRG. That allows us to inhale, turns on PRG, VRG, which turns the dorsal back off, allows the box to close, which is exhale, and allows the anoustic center to turn it back on again. So let's watch it one more time, but then you can always come back and watch this over and over to get it. So breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in, breathe out. So remember, the anoustic center signals are constant, so once it's no longer inhibited, it just turns the DRG right back on again. Breathe in, breathe out. So I hope that helped. I love this little box. It cracks me up every time. So watch this as many times as you need to. Now that you've gotten that, let's move on and let's talk about chemical regulation of breathing. There's 3 main things that the body is going to respond to when it comes to this. Changes in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, written PCO2, changes in the hydrogen ion concentration. So this would be like acidosis or alkalosis, and a lack of oxygen or hypoxia. Now, the main factor here for all of these things is called the carbonic acid reaction. Now, you may have seen this before in chemistry, but this is the basis for most of our acid-base balance in the body. So we start with CO2, which gets added to water. And when that happens, they together become H2CO3, which is carbonic acid. But carbonic acid is super unstable, and it never stays that way. It always breaks back up again. And so that carbonic acid is going to break apart into hydrogen and bicarbonate. Now, as you can see, this reaction can actually go either way. And so if we see that we have too much CO2, we're going to send the reaction this way. If we don't have enough CO2, we'll bring it back this way. So you can go to the right or to the left, depending on what your body's situation is. So let's look at a couple of examples of what happens to our breathing because of these reactions. Remember, our lungs, as they breathe, they exhale CO2. So this is where the lungs come into play. So first we'll talk about hypercapnia. Hypercapnia is a high partial pressure of carbon dioxide or a high PCO2. Now remember, partial pressure is just a fancy way that we measure the concentration of gases. So if I have a lot of CO2, I've got tons of CO2 over here, the carbonic acid reaction, or the CAR, is going to shift to the right. That leads to more hydrogen ion concentration in the blood. This hydrogen ion concentration sends signals to the medulla, remember those breathing centers, and it tells us to increase our respiratory rate. By increasing our respiratory rate, we're going to be able to exhale more CO2. This CO2 level is going to decrease back down to where we want it. This reaction is going to stop or reverse. It's going to stop the signals to the medulla and return us to normal breathing. So basically, it's this feedback loop. Too much CO2, create more hydrogen, tell the brain to breathe faster, get rid of the CO2, stop creating more hydrogen, brain signals stop, and my breathing goes back to normal. So another time we see basically the same reaction is in acidosis. Acidosis is when we have too much hydrogen ion concentration in the blood. Now, the only difference here is that the excess hydrogen may not be from this reaction. It might be because of other acids in the blood. But ultimately, we see the same response. That excess hydrogen concentration sends a signal to the medulla, and it increases our respiratory rate. The goal here is that we would breathe off more CO2. By having less CO2 over here, we can shift the reaction away from that hydrogen this way to the left. That will ultimately, hopefully, decrease our hydrogen ion concentration, return us to normal breathing. However, remember that this could actually be from any kind of acid. And so if the CO2 is not the culprit, then this process is just going to continue until we actually fix the source of the problem. If we don't correct the actual original problem, then that fast breathing continues and continues. So remember, acidosis not caused by too much CO2. We always have to correct the source of the problem in order to fix the patient. Lastly, the body has peripheral chemoreceptors that are going to respond pretty strongly, actually, to low oxygen concentrations in the tissues, otherwise known as hypoxia. This is also going to send signals to the medulla to help increase our respiratory rate and depth to try to get more oxygen into our system. Now, one thing to note here is that at high altitudes, the atmosphere tends to actually have less oxygen in it. So when people go up to higher altitudes, like if they're climbing a mountain or something, then we'll see their respiratory rate increase to try to help them get more oxygen. This is actually a normal response. Over time, the body might acclimate, the respiratory rate might come down a little, but generally speaking, it stays relatively higher than it would at sea level. Now, I can tell you this from personal experience. I recently moved from South Carolina to Colorado, and holy moly, I'm always breathing really fast, especially when I work out. I get short of breath going upstairs just because my body is trying to get more oxygen. I went from about 100 feet above sea level to 6,500 feet. So definitely feeling the effects of less oxygen, that's for sure. All right, let's recap. Remember that our bodies have both nervous and chemical control of our breathing. We have 4 main breathing centers in the medulla and the pons, both in the brainstem. We have the anoustic center, the DRG or dorsal respiratory group, VRG or ventral respiratory group, and the PRG or pontine respiratory group. Now, these groups are going to work together to help create this negative feedback loop, and as the signals cycle around to help us create that respiratory cycle of inhalation and exhalation. And then remember that the main chemical factors that affect our breathing are changes in our partial pressure of carbon dioxide, our hydrogen ion concentration, and a lack of oxygen. And a huge contributor to all of this is the carbonic acid reaction, or the CAR. We're going to talk more about the role of the carbonic acid reaction in the lesson on the respiratory functions of blood, so make sure that you check that out.
Thanks for watching another nursing.com lesson. Click the link below in the description to watch thousands more lessons over on nursing.com. Also, be sure to hit the subscribe and the little bell to make sure you're reminded when new lessons come out. And if you want to just keep watching more lessons, go ahead and click this video over here to continue learning. Like we always say here at nursing.com, happy nursing.